What is so great about Bob Dylan that he's getting called the greatest singer-songwriter lyricist of all time? With the new Timothée Chalamet biopic coming out, A Complete Unknown, Hollywood has been desperately trying to convince us through the media that it's going to be great. And many people, especially younger people who were not born at the time that the story takes place, are starting to question what the hype is about. And if you're like me, you probably have little faith in biopics at this point, after too many tearful, hollow disappointments. And whatever you think of their choice of lead actor, I am not sure that anyone could accurately portray Bob Dylan. I also was not alive at the time that this story takes place, I will admit. However, I'm a historian of 20th century music, and I doubt that any dramatic recreation could ever truly capture the feeling of the 60s. Hindsight hasn't exactly been 20/20 for that particularly hazy decade. So let's hop back to the 1950s, when Bob Dylan was still going by Robert Zimmerman, just a Midwestern Jewish kid learning to play music. He discovered Woody Guthrie, Depression-era singer, author, and Dust Bowl refugee, who traveled around the United States advocating for marginalized people. Famous for protest songs, Woody Guthrie also wrote the autobiographical Bound for Glory. Bob followed Woody Guthrie's lead by leaving Minnesota for New York City. So it's Greenwich Village, 1960, and he walked into the first music club that he could find, even before he had a place to stay. The Village was alive with creativity, having hosted the earlier folk scene of the 1940s and subsequently the beatnik era, when it was the home to people like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg.
I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness.
By this new decade, communication was more widespread than ever. Television exploded with popularity, and nearly every home in America soon had access to public broadcasting. Seeing with their own eyes the civil rights protests, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the presidential elections on television stirred emotional reactions like never before. And it was in this climate that 20-year-old Bob Dylan started covering protest songs from the 30s and 40s, attracting the notice of the old folkies like Pete Seeger, who'd been friends with Woody in the early days. It was Suze Rotolo, the girl on the cover of the Freewheelin album, who profoundly influenced Bob Dylan's approach to songwriting. Suze was an activist and the daughter of confirmed communists, a bohemian if there ever was one. She detailed all of her experiences living in the Village in her book called A Freewheelin Time, which describes her work in the civil rights movement and her relationship with Bob Dylan. She was an active member in the Congress for Racial Equality and awakened Dylan to the injustices all around him. But Suze was also Dylan's first love and was the inspiration for most of his early love songs. She introduced him to the author Arthur Rimbaud, whose work helped shape Dylan's lyrical style going forward. And though he made many bold statements in his songs about the condition that America was in, none of them hit quite like Blowin' in the Wind. To him, it wasn't a protest song at all, but a very plain observation about what was happening in America during that time. How many roads must a man walk down before he's called a man? How much is expected of us as people before we're allowed basic human rights? Dylan wasn't the first one to make the song famous. Peter, Paul, and Mary, formed by Albert Grossman, who would later become Bob Dylan's manager, released their version on the radio just a couple of weeks after Dylan's version came out, spreading the song like wildfire. The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan is particularly iconic because it was Dylan's first album of mostly self-written tracks, unlike his debut, which only had 2 original songs. Blowin' in the Wind opens the album, but the entire record is full of lyrical marvels. A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, Let Me Die in My Footsteps, Don't Think Twice, It's Alright, capturing a cultural zeitgeist amid massive social upheaval. There was some dread, a little apathy, a lot of desperation, and some dedication to perseverance in those lyrics. Bob Dylan was very young when he wrote those songs, and when he speaks about them in retrospect, it's very clear that he knows that better than anyone, acknowledging that the likelihood of him being able to write a song like that today is extremely improbable. Now, by this time, Dylan had already met the folk singer Joan Baez, who'd been singing in the folk music scene since she was a teenager. Brought up as a Quaker, Joan Baez believed in prioritizing human rights, and she spent her entire life advocating for marginalized people around the world.
Do you think nonviolence will solve any American problem?
I think it's the only thing that can solve the American problem. I think partly because of the war in Vietnam is affecting, that age. And they've decided it's a stupid idea, the war. And I think a lot of students are much more political.
increasing.
Yes.
Through her own success, she introduced Bob Dylan to the folk community on a larger scale. At the Newport Folk Festival in late July 1963, she invited him up on stage with her, introducing him to the people who would glorify him as the voice of a generation.
I wrote this song called With God on Your Side. This is a ballad of sorts. It tells a story if you if you like stories. Well,
Maybe he doesn't do anything.
maybe it doesn't tell a story. Oh, my name, it is nothing. My age, it means less.
They played the song With God on Our Side, a new one at the time which would appear on Dylan's forthcoming album, which would be released the following spring, called The Times They Are A-Changin'. When Bob got back to New York after the Newport Festival, he admitted to Suze that he'd been having an affair with Joan Baez, leading her to pack up her stuff and move in with her sister. But it wasn't until the weeks following that she would discover she was pregnant, subsequently choosing to have an abortion. Bob and Suze officially ended their relationship early the following year. Bob Dylan started working on his next album, The Times They Are A-Changin', on August 8th, 1963, when America was in the thick of the civil rights movement. Less than 3 weeks later, Dylan was asked, alongside Joan Baez and Peter, Paul, and Mary, to perform at the monumental March on Washington, which would go down in history as the event where Dr. Martin Luther King would deliver his I Have a Dream speech.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
Here was Dylan, 22-year-old kid, who wrote folk songs, standing behind some of the greatest leaders of the 20th century, looking out at the biggest crowd he'd ever seen in his life, listening to words that would henceforth alter the course of history. The musicians played for about an hour at the midday break. They played a few of Dylan's songs, including The Hour That the Ship Comes In, and most poignantly, he played Only a Pawn in Their Game, a song that he had written about the injustice surrounding the murder of Medgar Evers, an NAACP field secretary and World War II veteran, who was assassinated at his home on June 12th that same year. Both songs would appear on the new album. A lot of people misunderstand Dylan's stance on activism. One might assume that the March on Washington radicalized him, but Dylan himself always saw beyond the superficial. He recognized that as a white folk singer, he could not compare himself to Dr. King or Medgar Evers or any of the freedom fighters out there risking their lives doing the real work. This realization created some complicated feelings for him as a young man suddenly cast as a leader, a position that he never sought out for himself. The Times They Were A-Changin' was meant to declare the end of the old world and the dawning of the new. Dylan borrowed the structure for the song from traditional Irish and Scottish ballads, and even included several biblical references. I wanted to write a big song, he said, with short, concise verses that piled up on each other in a hypnotic way, when he showed the song to his friend and fellow musician Tony Glover. He questioned the line, "Come senators, congressmen, please heed the call." Dylan replied, "This seems to be what the people want to hear from me." Less than 1 month after finishing recording the album, Dylan and the entire world were shocked by the assassination of JFK on November 22nd, 1963. 3 weeks after that, he was given the Tom Paine Award by the Emergency Civil Liberties Union, which he accepted with a speech that outraged everyone. He basically said, "You are all old rich people, and me and the friends who I work with, we aren't like you. This isn't a matter of left or right," he said. "It's a matter of up and down." He then compared himself to Lee Harvey Oswald, who was thought to be responsible for the assassination of JFK, stating that he saw a little bit of what that man must have felt in himself. This shocked the crowd of nicely dressed Democrats who could not believe their ears. Maybe the best way for people today to relate to Bob Dylan and his work is to understand what it must have been like having these massive, culture-shaking events happen one right after the other. Barely any time to process anything before something else even bigger happened immediately afterwards. He was tired and weary, and everybody was looking at him to be the voice of a generation. musician, a position he never sought out when he picked up his guitar just a few years earlier. This was immense pressure, and with the release of his next album, it was about to multiply exponentially. Just a few weeks later, February 9th, 1964, the Beatles arrived in America, revolutionizing music and celebrity culture. The Times They Are Changing came out the very next day, but it was full of songs that represented a Bob Dylan who no longer existed. Within just 6 months' time, he'd been totally disillusioned by the music industry, by politics, and by any movement that he'd found himself at the forefront of. But what no one, least of all Dylan himself, would realize was that despite his best efforts, the impact that he would have on culture and music was just beginning. After all of the drama surrounding his position as the author of finger-pointing songs, as he called them, Bob Dylan was making a pointed effort to disregard any interest in activism, including and especially in his music. On top of that, his relationship with Suze Rotolo, his first love, was over, and he'd taken off to Europe for a short tour and some time away from America. The songs that he wrote during this period were therefore more personal than Dylan had ever done before. These songs included Mama, You've Been on My Mind, and Ballad in Plain D, an 8-minute, 17-second epic which told the story of how his relationship fell apart. That song would be included on his following album, Another Side of Bob Dylan, which would be released August 8th, 1964. This record would demonstrate Dylan's ability to use incredibly simple, layman's language to impart complex emotions in his storytelling, and it is full of emotion. And it seems that this was on purpose, since Dylan recorded the entire record in 3 hours, one night in early June with his producer Tom Wilson, friends, and musicians that he literally picked up off the street, all while hammering down a couple of bottles of French wine. As a result, the record reads like a drunk, heartbroken poet who has thought endlessly about every possible angle from which to examine his relationship. In July, he played the new songs at the Newport Folk Festival, yet again, and this is the one where he met Johnny Cash and received a lot of mixed reviews from critics and fans, most of whom were unimpressed with his purposeful avoidance of serious topics such as war and equality as he had done in his previous work. They called him inauthentic, they claimed he wasn't being honest, and he defended himself by saying that he didn't write songs for anyone but himself because he needed to write them. And in that, there was inherent honesty. That summer, Bob spent the majority of his time staying at the home of his manager, Albert Grossman, who had a place in upstate New York in a little town called Woodstock. While he was there, he spent the majority of his time writing, all day, every day, tapping away at his typewriter. He occasionally returned to the city, where he finally met the Beatles. He'd had his eye on this band for a while, before they even got to America, and had since expressed admiration for their innovation with regard to harmonies and arrangements, their take on the American blues. This meeting would be a landmark event in music history, if for no other reason that these two artists heavily influenced each other's music for at least the remainder of the decade. Afterwards, Bob started working with his producer Tom Wilson, who would later work with Simon and Garfunkel, the Velvet Underground, and the Mothers of Invention, just to name a few. They were experimenting with blending pre-recorded electric backing tracks with earlier Dylan recordings. At the same time, John P. Hammond, singer, and the son of John Hammond Sr., who had originally signed Dylan to Columbia 4 years earlier, was creating an album of his own, but with a backing band of electric blues musicians. Those musicians that he hired to undertake this project were from a traveling group called the Hawks, guitarist Robbie Robertson, drummer Lee Von Helm, and multi-instrumentalist Garth Hudson, who, along with bassist Rick Danko and singer Richard Manuel, would later form the band. Bob loved it, and he wanted to do the same thing himself. So they got some session musicians together, and they recorded a bunch of new songs over several sessions, all while actively experimenting with how exactly this was going to work with a high-profile artist like Bob Dylan. All the sounds had to go up when you added drums, but Dylan was also very conscious of his lyrics, taking yet again an entirely new approach. This album would be split between songs where he was backed by his own electric blues rock group and acoustic tracks with minimal instrumentation. Some were openly critical of society, like one of his biggest hits, Subterranean Homesick Blues, heavily inspired by the Chuck Berry song Too Much Monkey Business.
To and fro, hard working at the mill, never fail in the mill, yet come a rotten bill.
But Others were very personal, yet relatable love songs like She Belongs to Me. There are classical tales of adventure utilizing surrealism and biblical references again. The songs maintained all the intensity of Dylan's previous work, with an added edge, such as in the brilliant song It's Alright Ma, I'm Only Bleeding, which is one of the acoustic songs on the record, but still feels as furious as any rock song that he would later create. Maggie's Farm is a song that references slavery and plantation life in a powerful metaphor about his own desire to not play the fame game, and it was this song that Bob Dylan chose to open his set at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. In what is maybe one of the most controversial moments in all of music history, Bob Dylan plugged in his guitar and invited some members of the Paul Butterfield Blues Band and a couple of his own session musicians on stage with him to try and recreate what they had done on the album. Dylan claims to have been surprised by this, but the response was astronomically negative. Pete Seeger is even rumored to have threatened to cut the cord to the amplifiers with an axe, supposedly needing to be physically subdued. Dylan was shaken by the event, but soon he realized that this was something that needed to happen to push music itself forward. And he would continue on this path with his following two albums, Highway 61 Revisited, later in 1965, and Blonde on Blonde in early 66. And for his subsequent tour, it was none other than Robbie Robertson and the Hawks, minus Levon Helm, who accompanied him as his backing band. And through all of this, Bob Dylan forged a new era of folk rock music that would shape popular music for decades to come.